that is a research guide available. I can distribute the link to that later on, but this archive will be available. The chats will be monitored. Kim graciously accepted to monitor the chats for us. If we catch it, just raise your hand and we should be able to get to it quickly as we can. But depending on the question, we could answer it there. If it's like a quick question, if it takes a little more time, we might have to pause it to either the middle or the end of the presentation. So, hope you understand for that. So going and getting into the presentation, I'd like to welcome all library staff and faculty who are here. Today, my unit, the Scholarly Communications, and also the Copyright Working Group are bringing to you all Copyright Coffee Talk. So let's see, most of you who are here have a pretty good definition of what copyright is, so I won't have to go into that. But really, the goal of this was to talk about how copyright applies to the special areas of the library. First, we're going to start with special collections today. In a couple of weeks, Joanne Paranduke will discuss how it applies to digital libraries and what's in their collection. And then at the end of the month, Larry, who is here, hi Larry, is going to talk about how it applies to government documents. So I'd like to thank you all for taking time to be here today, and also to Vicki. And then we'll roll into the questions that I had for her. We did go over the questions beforehand. We had a really interesting talk. I learned so many things about special collections before, but while I was doing the preparation, I thought about Vicki, and I've been here since 2008, and I'm like, well, let's see. I know she's from Georgia. I know she has a really big interest in crocheting. And then as I was thinking, it's like, well, wait a minute, it all kind of goes together. So Vicki, I understand your interest in crocheting, but also material culture. Can you tell us a bit about that, just as a little introduction to special collections, and before we go into that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my interest in needlework actually starts with embroidery. I was about 9 years old and my grandmother pulled me aside and taught me how to embroider. And it was something that all the women in my family did. It was sort of it became a hobby and a pastime, but in difficult times, that's actually how they would keep the family going. Like during the war, that's how they made pocket money during World War II. My family is French, and that's how it became a tradition that was passed on, almost like an heirloom in of itself of craft. And I'm a huge fan of yarn. So I moved from tiny little skeins of embroidery thread to giant skeins of yarn. And I just love working with my hands. I like to create things. And it feeds into material culture because my master's thesis in the history department here at FAU was Gifts from Home, American Immigrant Women in the 20th Century. And I focused in on embroidery and what's created. And that drove me to material culture because material culture simply are the objects that tell stories. And it's a form of storytelling, but with materials, with actual physical objects. And traditionally, material culture is the items that are created by people and left and passed on. So I just sort of combined all those little favorites into one and just have taken it with me. It's one thing I try to focus on when we do exhibits is I try to bring a lot of material culture in because it what connects people to the past.
Yeah, so what you do really is telling a story in a lot
Yeah.
of ways. It's definitely something almost universal. All these cultures have some sort
Hmm.
of embroidery or artistry with that, and a female thing too, but also the fact that it preserves something too, to some extent. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a wonderful way to do storytelling. So I've always, the minute someone's like, well, I have this item, I'm like, tell me its story. There's got to be a story behind it. And that's
Yeah.
what also connects to all the collections. Every collection has a story in of itself.
Yes, and as I thought about your experience and what you were talking to me about, I thought, wow, wait a minute. Of course she's a special collections librarian.
Yeah. Hand in hand.
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely.
Well, thank
Literally.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for telling us about that too. I mean,
Sure.
it's definitely helped my understanding about all of that as well. So you've been how long have you been with Special Collections now?
I was attached to Special Collections in 2009 in University Archives. I've
Okay.
been working for the University Libraries since 2002 officially as staff,
Mhm,
and about late 90s, I started as a student worker.
mhm. Okay. And then, wow. And then you eventually ended up in Special Collections and
Hmm.
kind of doing your hobby in a way.
In a way, yeah, I get to connect all the loves and actually channel it into a profession. I'm a very incredibly humbled and lucky person.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, so now we'll go into the special collections of the FAU libraries. I did make some questions up for Vicky. We did go over some of the questions to some of the phrases I said, like, well, wait a minute, that's not quite how an archivist would say it. Okay, so she was able to help me tweak some of the phrases and things like that, refine the questions. But the first question I'd like to talk about is the set of questions would be the collections. So could you describe some of the special collections, main collections that they possess?
Sure. So when we think about special collections, think of it as an umbrella term for everything else that lives within. I also like to think of special collections as the island of misfit toys because we're all creatives and we've all found a way to each other. But I would say there's about 3 or 4 major subdivisions within special. One, of course, is the Jaffe Center for Book Arts, where it's a collection that's centered on book arts and letterpress and paper-making traditions. We have Recorded Sound Archives, which does the history or focuses on the history of recorded music. And then we also have University Archives, which is the historical aspect of the university. It's all the papers, records, and documents and photographs. And then we have Special Main, which is predominantly a rare book and manuscript collection. And within that, we have specialties like the Weiner collection, which is American Revolution focused and actually goes up to about the American Civil War. And we always say American Revolution, but there's something for somebody in that collection. We have everything from English Civil War, French Revolution, American Civil, all kind of tied together.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody from Venezuela, and I didn't really know how much the American Revolution had inspired theirs. I guess Simone
Hmm.
Bolivar was really inspired by what had happened, how the common man was able to basically regain autonomy, self-rule, and all of that from a colonial and monarch at that. So yes, I could see how all those different movements are very interrelated.
Definitely. And you think of the American Revolution, afterwards, it's the French Revolution, and then it kicks off what a lot of historians call the Age of Revolution. So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So here's where I'm going to ask some questions about where
Okay.
Special Collections gets materials. One of the things that I was actually curious about was what types of materials do you normally get? Or, you know what, I probably can't say normally, but how about just what kind? What kind do you get?
It all depends on the collecting strengths and collecting areas. I look for materials. What happens in well, how materials are collected into special depends on the person in my role
Mm,
and what they have access to financially, and what we can also have access to in our terms of donors, and how that fits with the instruction and curricula of the university,
yeah.
and how that fits in with what the libraries is looking for to do for its forward. But how we actually collect materials, if we purchase, I try to purchase manuscript, so letters and documents
Ah,
that
okay.
will help differentiate us from other collections, because sooner or later we all will have the same monographs,
Mhm.
but it's those handwritten materials that usually differentiate us the most.
That are very unique, one of a
Hmm.
kind and rare. Okay.
And then topics. We have some great strengths, like in the American Revolution, we have a lot of great strengths, but there's other areas where we have what we call archival silences, which we need to
Hmm,
address as well.
interesting. I never heard that term before.
Oh yeah, archival silences is when you have a body of literature or history, a collection, if you will, and within that collection there are gaps,
Mm, mhm.
and those gaps lead to our archival silences.
So, I mean, it's not so much that you're trying to just get everything. You're very focused on the type of materials and
Hmm.
also the subject areas, and you really want to align that with the university and its focuses and emphases in teaching at the time.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I believe special collections should be tied to teaching, because that it gives a natural branch for the students to reach out and gives them opportunities to do research as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and you do quite a bit of that too, which we could
Yeah.
talk about later if we have time for
Okay,
that. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
So how about materials for the Jaffe Center for the Book Arts? How can you tell us a bit about that collection and how it gets its materials?
John, well, part of it I have to say stems from Arthur, his love of books,
Mm,
his love of artists, and his passion to help create and continue that genre. He People would actually donate books to us and give materials to us just based on their relationship with Arthur over the
Arthur
years.
Arthur Jaffe was the
Arthur Jaffe,
person who
yeah,
started
sorry,
that. Yeah,
Arthur
his
and Matta
starting.
Jaffe. Yeah, they started the collection with 70,000 volumes, and it has,
Ooh,
or seven, about that, maybe a little bit under that, um, material, and they started that collection, and I don't think it was 70,000. I'm sorry. But we
It's a lot.
started that collection and it came to the university library. And of course, John has done a fabulous job, in the director, in growing that collection.
Mhm.
And he's looking to add materials that highlight sort of book history, but also different avenues of book history and different voices.
Mhm.
So this year's Ways Goose features Star Shaped Press. I forgot her name, who is the proprietor of Star Shaped Press. But when she does her book design, she uses a lot of what they call ornamentals. So it's a different style of book arts.
Yeah, when I learned about that collection, I was really amazed that they actually look at books as a work of art. We think
Hmm.
of art as painting, sculpture, maybe even calligraphy, but this time it's like the book itself. It could be expressed in so many ways.
And it's the book itself, it's the paper
Mhm.
too.
The
They teach people
materials.
actually how to make paper and then paper structures. And I had never thought of a paper. I'm like, John, what do you mean a paper structure? I'm a rare book person, but,
Mhm.
and he's like, no, it's how they actually create the paper and then how they can use the paper and how the paper can change and transform.
Mhm. Ah,
And how it actually paper, and Jeannie Jaffe, who's Arthur Jaffe's son, she spends a lot of time with us. And she did a fabulous workshop on storytelling and
oh,
actually creating paper to tell your stories with
oh,
puppets and shadow puppets.
so it's another form of storytelling and
It
also
is,
preserving of those stories too.
exactly. And also a wonderful part about the book arts is that it's all made to be interactive in a way, if you will.
Ah, yes.
It's the original, not only is it the original sort of maker space, if you will, it's
Yeah,
also
I
one of
think
the
there's a
original
myth.
storytellings, because every time you interact with one of those books, it reveals a different part of itself to you.
Mm.
But
Mm.
it's your interaction with that material.
Almost like a person.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
It's a
Yeah,
great way to put, yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, I'm just going to step it up a little bit. You had
Okay.
mentioned something about the archives. So during our conversation, you provided me with some really eye-opening information about university records, what special collection does, and what some outside offices do, particularly the FAU Office of the Registrar. Can you describe their role with handling university records and documents and how your area steps in? Because I think this is something the rest of the listeners would love to hear about.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
So when everyone comes to visit university archives, they think, oh, you have everything, the history of the university from day one to now. And it's like, well, not exactly.
Mhm.
We have, so for starters, archives, what the materials that are in university archives are traditionally considered dead records. And by that, I mean they're records that are no longer in use by the current administration.
Mm.
So the records that come to us are materials that are much older than the current administration. But they first stop off at the records manager, and that person is housed over in the registrar.
Mm. Okay.
And that, yeah, so it's a separate entity from us. Some universities, it's with university archives, the records manager, and other places it's separate. And they have their I would say the pros and cons of each.
Mhm. Yeah.
But for us, being that it's in the registrar's office, they have to look at the state retention schedule for the state of Florida. So they have to send off some materials back to the state. Some materials stay in perpetuity with FAU, and then some materials get to come to us.
Interesting. So the state actually has rules about record keeping.
Yes, they do. Actually, on their website, they actually break down for you which materials they collect and which materials need to be sent to them. And they actually have all the forms and paperwork.
I knew that, but you tell it better,
Oh,
and you work
no,
with it a lot more than I do. So,
it's been tough though. Since COVID, they have a new person in that role. So trying to coordinate and get on board with everyone to make sure, oh, hey, don't forget about university archives. We have to make sure we can take some collections in, but we also have to make sure we run it by the records manager to make sure that we're in compliance.
and is that the division of state that runs that, in which the
Yes.
library division is under, division of
Yes.
library? That's what I thought. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's what I thought. So yes, I mean there is a degree of regulations that special collections does have to follow.
Yeah.
Because it has to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And we have to follow FERPA, of course.
Yes, FERPA, the
Family Education Rights Privacy Act.
thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so next I'm going to go into the collections, talking about the stewardship, ownership, and copyright of the collections. And here's
Okay.
where we get a little more detailed. And
The tough
the same,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. So if you need any, if anybody, any of the participants need any clarification or have any questions about that, definitely put it in the chat. Then we can try to address or clarify some things that way. So I'll start out with this one. I understand that special collections have differing rights and responsibilities over its materials in the collection. This is known as stewardship, if I'm not mistaken, that you maintain. You maintain some works, you maintain things in your collection, even though you might not necessarily own it, some of it per se.
Yes. So there's some materials that we in special collections, and according to the deed of gift, we own a lot of the physical material, the actual physical property. So the book itself. We don't always own, like say if it's a photograph, that actual image itself. We own the physicality of it.
Hmm.
But a lot of our material is actually in the public domain.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's
because
much older. It's our Civil War letters, of course, our 19th century. Um, but a good example of what you're talking about would be the Glasser collection.
mhm,
Howard Glasser was a fascinating man. He was a World War II veteran. He was a bombardier. And he also went on to be president of a little tiny pageant off the coast of California that the rest of us now know as Miss Universe, and he ran the pageant for 30 years. So there's a wonderful array of material in the collection. So you have a lot of his veteran World War II material. You have him also fighting for his veterans' rights.
mhm.
You would think that someone who is as well connected, he himself was a lawyer, would not have to fight tooth and nail for his rights as a veteran, and he did. And all of that's also in the collection.
Oh,
Yeah. But if you look at his Miss Universe, his widow, Mrs. Glasser, gave us all of the pageant tapes because he had a run, and then she had them digitized. So if somebody wanted to do research with them, or if we wanted to show them during an exhibit, which we have, we could, because they'd be on CDs for us. But I can't take that and like give it to, digital library and say, okay, now go ahead and put this online, because we don't have the right to distribute that information. That's actually owned by the pageant.
so the copyright is owned by the pageant, even though you have
The
possessed the
physical,
physical
yes.
object. I see. Mhm.
Yeah, but we can open it up for research if somebody wants to view a set of tapes to see what the contestants were wearing or how they answered questions.
Yeah, I think that's the part that a lot of people were curious about when it comes to a lot of your collections. Who owns what? How can it be
Mhm.
used? So even though the Miss Universe Corporation owns the broadcast, you have the physical recordings, and that you can distribute it in a way that people can study it or learn from it or teach with it, perhaps in
Right.
a
I can
limited
share it with
way.
them in an environment that, as being part of special collections, that it's educational
Mhm.
and
Okay.
fall under, yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about was you had mentioned what a donor agreement was, a gift in kind, and acquired purchase material. It sounds like the Glasser collection was an acquired material that they had donated it to you, or
They donated to us, so it was a gift in kind.
okay. And a gift in kind is something that someone who owns these items or materials has the right to give to you, and they do that. Does that sound
And
about right?
no monetary transactions take place. Like they're not expecting a tax write-off for that kind of a thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so in kind. Okay, that's where that comes from. Okay, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
there's no monetary attachment to that gift.
Hmm.
I think the Glasser might have been different because that actually came to us from foundations.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you might be thinking of the Philip Johnson collection that was recently donated. It's faculty papers.
Hmm.
That's a gift in kind.
Hmm. Oh, what's that collection?
That's an architecture professor. He retired about 10 years ago, and it's interesting the way the collection came to us was through Dr. Cunningham. She had reached out to talk to him about some of the campuses, some of the, I guess, the buildings and sort of the history, the architectural history of the campus. And we don't have a lot of that material in university archives.
Mhm.
So she reached out to him as, an architecture professor who was, I think, a dean for a while. And he actually said, well, I have all my material. Here it is. And this is some of the things I've worked on. And she said, you should talk to Vic about having your material added in as faculty papers for university archives. He's like, I never thought of that, but that would be a great place to put all my years of research. So fascinatingly, he worked on one of the first AME churches in Tybee Island. He
Oh,
also
Georgia.
studied in Georgia. Yes, sorry. And then he also studied the Gullah Geechee in formerly enslaved persons in the Carolinas who made their way down into Florida when it was under Spanish control. They had something called Fort Mose or Fort of Freedom. And once the people got to the state of Florida, they had their freedom.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
the Gullah, they were mostly they're African American, right? And they spoke a
mhm,
distinctive language, and they lived
yes,
mostly on the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, and then
yes.
they made their way down this way. Yeah, so a
Mhm.
very small group, and but yet he wanted to preserve their culture and history.
And it was fascinating because when Spain left Florida and turned Florida back over, they actually evacuated Fort Mose and they took all of those people who were formerly enslaved and had their freedom to Cuba.
Mm.
And they actually continued on that Gullah Geechee community into Cuba.
Oh, wow.
So that's what he was kind of tracking,
Yeah, to preserve the culture, see how it formed, see what else it did,
right? And
and
see their
especially with
buildings,
and all the migration that they had to do
right?
too. Absolutely,
Yeah,
to document it and how did it continue and preserve, how did they preserve themselves?
exactly. He did a lot of research and on their buildings and everything that they were now doing in Cuba, or what the history of what he found when he, got to Cuba in this, I think, 70s, 80s. And then he was trying, his dream was to retrace back, but he just, he said, I retired.
Okay,
And
and it's
he's
and now
hoping yeah, he's hoping now in retirement to do that, or one of the students will pick up the passion and sort of continue the research.
he's passing the baton.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you had mentioned here's a little human interest element to it. You said it took him a while to hand over the collection.
I find that a lot with faculty in particular. They'll come and talk to me right before they retire about possibly adding their materials to university archives. And I'm like, okay, sure, I understand. And they'll give me a little bits at a time.
Mhm.
So he actually in December called and said, okay, I'm ready to let you have these 5 boxes. And I was like, okay, great. We'll come get your 5 boxes and we'll talk about the paperwork and all the other material. And he's like, I'm not ready to give everything else up yet. And I was like, I understand.
Kind of
It's
like a
it's
child leaving home.
exactly, exactly. They've worked with these materials for decades. It's their life research.
Very
So,
personal too,
and very
intellectual,
personal.
but very personal, sure.
Yeah, because he did a lot of his work with students and did a lot of that early experiential learning that's
Mhm,
become so common now with students, teaching them this is how you actually do architectural preservation.
mhm. Interesting. So he was already doing a high impact education practice
Exactly,
and with
right?
the
Long
topic
before
he
it
loved.
became, um, I guess,
High
standard.
impact. Yeah.
Yeah, he was leading the way.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, so then they get the special collections gets their materials in the three different in those different ways. Donor agreements. Could you tell us about what is usually included in a donor agreement and what that allows or does it
Right.
or what it has you do?
Yeah. Donor agreements depending. Some donor agreements are done with foundation's office because that depends on the elements within the document. The document's really an instrument that outlines the expectation of the university and the expectation of the donor.
So it's like a contract in a
Hmm.
way.
That's
Mhm.
exactly what it is.
So
And they lay out, and each donor agreement is of course different depending on collection, the needs, and the library. So like for Weiner, we have an agreement where we'll have 2 events a year. That's in the donor agreement. And the
Mhm.
donor agreement is also that the materials will be kept separate from the rest of special collections. So
Okay.
that's why it's on the 5th floor.
Mhm. They want a unique space, and these are things that the
Exactly.
donor and their
Hmm.
families wish to have and wish to be followed. Mhm.
Exactly. So it's really expectations. It's that kind of a discussion that happens. With Glasser, we have a couple of exhibit cases. I'm pointing this way because there's exhibit cases out that way that have Glasser material that she would like permanently on display. So we change those cases out every semester as well.
That's the bomber jacket, right? The
That's the
bomber
bomber
jacket
jacket, yeah,
there.
which
Mhm.
we just sent to George Swartz for Conserve Art to have some restoration work done and some cleaning.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of housekeeping and record keeping going on in your area. It's
continually.
always.
And it's when I talk to the students and I talk to them about finding aids and how to use materials, I always tell them you make sure you write down collection name, box, and folder. It's all part of good housekeeping. So intellectually you have housekeeping and physically we have housekeeping.
Absolutely, yes, yes. So you get a lot of collections and materials for your area. Uh, some Do you always know who owns it? I mean, how do you determine the ownership of these materials as you receive them?
It really depends on material that how it comes in. It's usually the person who's giving it to us owns it.
Mhm.
So a great example is we had, I believe, a gentleman looked through our collections and he saw we didn't have this one edition that that he was a part of a group that produced a diary of Anne Frank
Oh, yes,
and
so tell me.
a letterpress edition, a rare letterpress edition, hand bound with beautiful illustrations. And he's like, I noticed you didn't have this, and it's a limited number copy. I think your library should have a copy.
You said they
And
were like only 350 made
there
and
was only
30
350 made.
libraries
Yeah.
only have it. Mhm,
Yeah. So it every now it's sometimes it's as simple as that.
mhm.
Sometimes I have people who find um American Revolutionary material that was made in the 70s, as that was part of the 1976 anniversary of 1776,
Yes,
as
yes.
we're coming up to the American Revolution at 250 in 2026. But
Yikes.
the yeah, so I'm always in the at some point I'm always in a revolution. Um, but it's funny because in the 1976 they re-released all this beautiful federal era, gorgeous material, replicated documents, and I'll have people come in and go, "This is an original constitution." And I have to go, well, I'm not allowed by state law to give evaluation statements or condition, but
Ah,
I can tell you this is a facsimile.
mhm.
And they're like, how do you know it's a facsimile? I'm like, because it says printed facsimile right there. Not only is the paper not right and it's the wrong size, but yeah, so it's interesting because I'll have people walk in to say, you have to see this.
Mhm,
And I think that's the best part of my job. One of the best parts is people love to show me what they have. It's that material culture connection again.
mhm. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So there was this is going into a little bit of copyright. I
Okay.
understand that your collection is cataloged manually for the most part. You have people that enter that information into your own version of a catalog, and that you usually will have finding aids for your collections. And that's found through your special collections webpage. Is that correct?
Correct. Well, we have two things. We have, and she's on the call, Malka, who's our wonderful rare book librarian who does fabulous cataloging.
Mhm.
And we also have Daniel Scheid, who's in Jaffe, who does fabulous cataloging for Jaffe and RSA.
Mhm.
So they handle the monographs and the manuscript, the monographs mainly.
Mhm.
And then we have the finding aids, and finding aids are simply a box and folder listing of the contents of a collection.
Mhm.
Because inherently the idea is a collection, it stays together like a little family.
Mhm. Yes, yes. So the finding aid will talk about what it'll define a collection, what's in it,
Mhm. The
one
scope and content, the overall dates, how many items, the size of those items sometimes,
like
the range of
sometimes
what those materials are.
sometimes I'd see like 7 cubic feet or something like that.
Yeah, the linear feet. We do linear feet because
Linear feet, I mean,
yeah,
yes.
cubic feet, my brain doesn't work that in volume.
Mhm. Well, I also see that a lot of them will have right statements too.
Mhm.
I don't think the librarians or the staff have heard much about those, but could you give us an introduction to the right statements?
Sure. So the right statements, when we think about them, we consider them to be I'm thinking, and we have two different types of statements mainly. We have conditionings governing access and conditionings governing use. So
Mhm.
access means the physical access to the material. Depending on the special collections you're working with or historical society, sometimes access is denied because the material is in conservation. Sometimes the material could be in digitization. Sometimes the material could be reorganized or had material donated or had additional materials donated to it,
Mhm.
and it has to be, reconfigured.
So it's
And then
kind of
there's
like a status, sort
yeah,
of like a status description. Okay.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So for us, we would think of those as conditionings governing access. And again, every special collections has its own flora and fauna, how they like their materials to be accessed and used.
Mhm.
Some materials, depending on fragility, it could be that it's only accessed via mimeograph if they had materials mimeographed at one time or digitized. Now, of course, it'd be digitized, but some places actually mimeograph their materials and they'll actually hand you a microfilm for you to go ahead and actually look through a
Mhm.
microfilm.
Yeah.
And then you have conditionings governing use, and that usually is the copyright.
Mhm.
Is that the copyright, kind of the copyright clause, if you will?
Mhm. And what kind of information would be in a right statement?
Usually we follow ours is Title 17 of the United States Code. It's
Mhm.
governing fair use.
Okay, okay. So then the right statement will usually give some sort of a statement about fair use,
Mhm.
and it's attached to a particular record in the collection.
Yeah.
So that tells the users like like how it kind of gives hint about how it could be used in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And we also have permission to publish forms. So if there's something you want to publish from,
Oh,
we actually will give you a form and then it lets you know that you're publishing with using our materials.
mhm.
And then
Wow.
we ask for a copy of what you've published.
Oh, wow. So,
Hmm.
gosh, what was I thinking about that? So you do have a way to kind of put in contract, so to speak, how users are going to use what they find in the special collections
Hmm.
for research or even publishing purposes, like they're going to publish a monograph or an article or something like that.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And depending on what kind of what their publisher requires in terms of rights statements, if it goes a little bit beyond what we can do, a single time use,
Hmm.
then that has to go to University Council for them to look at and review.
Okay, so you in your area do handle the more general, like just one-time use by a scholar kind of
Hmm.
thing. Mhm,
For
mhm,
publication, yeah.
mhm. And then you mentioned something about in perpetuity rights.
In perpetuity.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't give those rights. That's University Council gives
Mhm.
those rights. We can't.
Okay.
Usually, when we think of in perpetuity, that means if it comes to university archives, we try to maintain that material in perpetuity
Mhm, okay, I see.
because we're talking about the history of the university.
Mhm,
And we're so young that, we should be able to keep everything that we have.
yeah. Okay, so since we just mentioned something about Title 17 in the U.S. U.S. Code, which is the copyright laws of the U.S., the U.S. copyright law has a few exceptions that allow copyrighted works to be used without permission. So I think you were telling me that Special Collections uses the fair use the most.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I also like the digital slider that kind of makes sure to help keep in mind what's in copyright because copyright changes. When it enters the public domain changes
Mhm.
every year.
Oh, and of course you use public domain too. That's probably
Yeah,
another part of the law you lean on a lot. Mhm.
yeah, exactly.
Is that the slide? Is it the ALA slider or the one from
Yes.
the oh, okay. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I'm familiar with the American Library Association copyright slider that's online. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's still used there. Yep. So
There's
you
so
were
many little tricky parts, especially with music. It can be very tricky.
oh,
Um, there's also other, depending on which works come in and out, that
mhm.
can be tricky during certain time periods.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, because the copyright law changed so much at different times that
Hmm.
like say a music score published in 1952 is going to have probably different the length of copyright protection than say something made in 1980, right? Something like
Right.
that.
Or say
Yeah.
1920 versus, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So, and then of course the type of material it's going to vary as well. Yeah, that's how it works there. Yeah, when we were talking about all that, you were saying that you need to use Section 108, which is reproduction by libraries and archives much. I think you said you don't really need to use Section 108 very much.
Well, yeah,
Reproduction.
because most of our material that we work with the digital library to get digitized is usually within public domain.
Oh, okay, right. So you don't have to on that. And then the first sale doctrine, not so much either. I mean, you were saying that Section 109.
Yeah, usually when we buy things though, if it's from, you know, the Civil War, we're usually not the first people to actually buy the set of letters. So,
Mhm. And it's not under copyright
and it's yeah,
protection.
exactly.
So that doesn't really apply. Well,
I
so
think that would be more Jaffe. They have more modern material.
mhm.
So that would be, I think, a better question for when we think about copyright and how it's used would be Jaffe.
Oh, okay. Okay. And then that kind of leads me to another question. This will be the last question about the stewardship, ownership, and copyright for special collections. One question that I had was how copyright is managed by the Jaffe Center for the Book Arts. I think of that because they have a Salzburg artist come in every year that creates a work commissioned by the Jaffe Center for Book Arts. So my question was, is it considered a work made for hire or does it belong to the creator? How does that work?
Okay, so the Salzburg residency is a wonderful opportunity for artists to do work in Jaffe using the Jaffe collection. Jaffe has a fantastic book arts collection. It's one of the best in the Southeast United States. If not, I'd even argue the Eastern Seaboard. We can rival some pretty big schools with the materials that we have in Jaffe. And it is a wonderful opportunity for us to have the artists come here, and it's a wonderful opportunity for the artists to get to interact with this fabulous collection. So when they actually create, they hold their copyright. And part of the rules of Salzburg is that we get a copy of their book.
Okay, so it's not considered a work made for hire or anything. I mean, of course, we pay them. They get some recognition. They get to
There's a
visit.
stipend.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
there's
a
an
stipend.
$8,000 stipend. They get the first half in the beginning, and they get the second half when we actually receive the physical item.
Okay. Okay, so it's not considered a work made for hire, because I was asked that a couple different times, and I said,
Yeah.
gee, I don't really know, so I'll have to
Yeah,
ask.
no, not a work for hire.
Mhm,
It's
mm,
a work of inspiration.
yes. Oh, definitely. Yes. All right. So okay, so now that as we wind down, I had some questions about just library, the library, how about the special collections within the library in general. One question I received before I go on to the rest of the questions was how you got the collection for the Barefoot Mailman. I did beforehand ask for questions from people in the email I sent. You're still more than welcome to send questions in chat or the form. And then also for Joanne and Larry later on in the month, you could send some questions too. But yes, how did you get the collection for Barefoot Mailman?
Sure, yeah. I guess it's going to turn into a Reddit AMA with Christy and Vicky.
Sure.
Um, so the Barefoot Mailman is actually part of the Theodore Pratt collection, and he was a local Florida after he drove down, him and his wife, he became a local Florida author, and he actually did work here at FAU. He had
Oh,
one of those old battleship World War II desks that
oh,
went back from when we were in an Army Air Base. So he actually left the materials to us because he wanted all of his collection to be housed in one location.
okay.
And he did so much work here at FAU that he felt we were the natural home for them.
Oh, good. Okay. And the Barefoot Mailman, he would basically walk all along the coast, right, in the early
It is
1900s.
the best crime story you've ever read, the
Yes.
way
Oh,
Theodore Pratt wrote it. Yes, exactly. He would walk up and down a portion of A1A to deliver mail.
mhm.
And at one point, he reached a juncture where he would have to get into a boat and cross.
Oh, wow. Whoa.
And one day he got there and the boat wasn't there.
Whoa.
And his body was not found, but his knapsack of letters and some clothing bits were found.
Uh-oh. So they never figured out what happened to him?
Nope.
Ooh, one of the
It's one
great
of the best.
unsolved
If you want a good
mysteries.
crime story, the Barefoot
Wow.
Mailman is a crime story.
And it happened right across the street from us, just about,
Yeah,
or down the street, either
down
one.
the street, literally.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you to who submitted that question. Thank you so much for
And
that.
it's a fabulous collection. We also have, he wrote The Incredible Mr. Limpet,
Oh, yes, I remember
which is the
that.
first stop action film between a cartoon and a human.
Don Knotts, right?
Don Knotts,
Mhm.
exactly. We have the original art cells
Mm.
that
Oh,
they used in the movie
mm.
as part of the collection.
That was a very charming movie.
Hmm.
Yes, yes.
They've been trying to remake it for years. The last version I heard was they were going to have Jack Black play the Don Knotts role.
Oh boy.
That'd be fabulous. I keep hoping that that happens.
Okay, I'll have to keep an eye on that for sure. Yes. So, all right. So I had a question about questions that the rest of the library. I had a question about a question about a question. So
That's very meta.
yes, very meta questioning here. So the librarians and the staff do get a lot of questions about special collection items. Can you provide some tips on how we all can help manage these questions and maybe kind of prep them for you or something like that? What suggestions could you give us?
So I think the best thing is to find out what they're actually looking for.
Mhm.
I find a lot of times we had someone one time get sent up to us for NASA stuff because they thought we had everything related to NASA. And it was like, no, unfortunately, we don't. We have a few things. It all depends on what they're looking for.
Mhm.
So I think finding out what their query is and what they're needing would be the most important.
Mm,
Because sometimes they actually think, oh, well, they have all of this on this one topic. They might have more. And in actuality, we don't. So that's where I think finding out what they're actually researching would be really important.
okay. So a very good reference query would be very important with these kinds of questions. Sometimes people may be able to answer the question on their own too, maybe, but
Right, right. Or if people would like more in-depth information about how to like use a finding aid and how to research a finding aid. And and how to show students how to, I'd be more than happy to show everyone how to do that.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very specialized thing. And one of the things, I was in reference instruction engagement for a long time. And um, it's just, for areas that we don't interact with very often, or we get the question once or twice a month, the muscle memory,
Right.
it's a little weak sometimes.
And I feel the same. It's whenever Larry shows me when he does a lot of the bibliographic instruction for history classes and I get to sit in on them, I'm like, I didn't know the database could do that because I don't use the databases. I jokingly say I live in the 18th century sometimes because that's the world I live in with material.
Mhm.
But I wholeheartedly understand how it can be a different world to search in the finding aids.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times when we're working with material and we actually process the material on that side, we're using the material, the language of the material itself.
Mhm.
So it's a totally different mindset you have to step into.
Mhm. Yep.
So a great example is when we think about university archives and people are searching for, the type of information we have now. In the 60s and 70s, they didn't have the computer power that we have now to
Mhm.
actually drill down, from this type of student to this type of college to this type of major to how
Mhm.
many are actually in. You
Yeah.
can do that now, but
Mhm.
in the 60s and 70s, they didn't have that ability.
Yeah, computing's definitely improved our ability to find things and to go more into detail or granular, but not
But
everything is digitized
not
yet.
everything is digitized.
Not everything.
And at the same time, the language that you use to describe some of the departments is different.
Mhm.
So in that time, they would call it minority student services, or
Mhm.
now we call it diversity initiatives.
Yep.
So the language of the material has changed. So it's like you have to make sure that you're using
The current language
the language of that time to search that time. So another
oh,
good
of
example
course.
is HR. We would just call it HR. Back then, they called it the Equal Opportunities Office.
Okay. Yep.
So it's that kind of exchange that has to happen sometimes when working with finding aids.
Yeah, it does definitely require a certain flexibility. Like one
Hmm.
of the things the librarians talk about is always look for synonyms for words,
Exactly.
child, children, kid, whatever medical
Exactly.
term. So same for your area too,
Same
for
for my
sure.
area. I always tell everybody keep a little pad of paper or, if you're on the phone or your iPad, a list of the things you searched for with
Hmm.
with the language. That way we can go back and look at it and go, oh, okay, well maybe, children doesn't work, but early elementary ed would work.
Right. Oh, wow. Just this, that's exactly what the reference librarians teach in their classes too.
Yeah,
Yes.
we do the same,
Just a little,
only
just a slightly different for your setting, but pretty much
yeah.
the same underlying concept. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So I don't see any questions in the chat at this time. If you have any, there's a last call for questions. But one more question I will ask Vicki is this. What are the 1 to 3 things you'd like the library staff and faculty to remember about special collections?
That we're here to help. I think if anything, the most important part is that we're here to help and we're here to help inspire and grow.
Mhm. Yeah, you have a lot of interesting materials in
Hmm.
there. It'll help people see things in a different way, a different perspective. Hopefully, think about how were they thinking at that point in time? How has it changed? There's so many ways that
Exactly.
it could go.
Because
Mhm.
every time I walk into the print shop or, Jaffe or even RSA, I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating. I had no idea RSA had those Vogue records,
Mhm.
which are these beautiful covers, sort of 1950s, 60s images. And I was like, this would be great to show to a class for like visual literacy, talking about know your meme kind of, but a modern version. But they had
Mhm.
all of these great images and it's like I had no idea. This is something that people need to be aware of. It's an interacting, one of my favorite books from Jaffe is called Metamorphosis. It's a book that has no words,
Mm. Oh
so I
boy.
don't know technically if we can call it a book, but as you work with the material it changes shape and it's your interaction with it. And I always step back and go, that's fascinating.
Mhm.
Another one is Maureen Cummins's Ghost Diary. She actually does research in archives and museums, and she took negative glass plates and did a hinge on one side so it kind of comes out like an accordion style. And she used the language and pictures from the archives.
Mm.
And I always thought that was like a perfect marriage between materiality, artist book, and archives.
Mm. Well, we'll have to go. We'll have to have a field trip. Who wants a field
Yes,
trip? Raise your hand.
field trip.
Field trip to the second floor. I do have one question from Lori,
Mhm.
and in chat, she asked, do you have a video showing persons how to use finding aids, or is one planned?
We've been planning one.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah, it's just a matter of us finding the right finding aid and going through it and doing that. But yeah, definitely that's in the planning works.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Because the
All
students get confused. I'll teach the classes upstairs and then they'll think, oh, the finding aids are OneSearch.
right. Mhm.
It was like, no, 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 OneSearch is something totally different. And they're
I
like, are you
see.
sure? But OneSearch searches everything. And it's like, well,
Mhm. Yeah,
yes, but not exactly.
I mean yeah, that's kind of an issue with finding aids is one size does not fit all because it just can't and it doesn't right now. There's just so
Right.
many different pockets of information. Like if somebody wanted to find tissue samples of like organs or whatever, they're not going to find it in one search, or they have there's just not one super search in the library quite yet.
Right. That works across all the platforms for everything and that's yeah. So if
Yeah.
I have students who are looking for, Clark family letters, they're not going to find it in OneSearch. We try to have everything cataloged at the collection level. So
Mhm,
at least if they're searching the catalog, it would pop there and lead them to the finding aid.
mhm.
But the students have gotten so used to OneSearch, like, oh no, everything's there. So yeah,
Yep.
it's
Click, 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 and you got the full material.
yeah,
Just a little
that
different. Mhm,
that on-demand world is a little is not always applicable. Sometimes it is through the work of the digital library, but
mhm.
not everything's there.
Right. Oh, Lori says yippee to the finding aids too. So yeah, you'll have some
And
eager
I'd like to
people.
have it in different languages too, that way to help support all the students
Mhm. Oh,
in
or
doing
even
their searching.
or international people who are quest who have want to use materials from the collection. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, if there weren't any questions, going, got my little gavel like the auctioneer. So, um, well, yeah, we don't have any other questions. I didn't see any additional ones on the Google Sheet. So I wanted to say thank you to you, Vicky. So thank you. Thank you
Yay.
so much for meeting with us today and opening the collection a little more to everyone. I'm so happy to say that I will have the recording and I'll put this on our Scholarly Communication Toolkit and YouTube. But other than that, unless is there anything else you wanted to say or add, Vicky?
No, but thank you. Thank you very much for offering me to talk about special collections and opening up for everyone.
All right. Larry says thank you. Great talk, Vicky and Christy. Ken says thank you. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day and thanks for being
Okay.
here today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Okay. Bye bye.